Let us pray. Let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Reformation Sunday. What does it mean to reform something? To change something. Yes, pretty much. To change. Who loves change? About 5 of us. That seems about right. That's representative of my experience here at House of Prayer with all of us. We love change, don't we? No. Friends, buckle up. We're going to talk a little bit about change this morning. I think change is a faithful topic for this morning for the Reformation. First of all, that's what the word means. At least that's what Darlene said. And so whatever word she said, I was going to preach on. So she said change, so that's where I'm going with this thing. So 500 years ago, Luther was at the monastery. He had had some amazing experiences where he got to go to Rome and see the fullness of the church there and other practices, and he started becoming frustrated with ways of the church. And he wasn't the first one ever to be frustrated with ways of the church. There were a long line of people that were frustrated before Luther, ones that said the exact same things as him. Maybe he just was in the right time, the right place. He was in Germany in the right era. The printing press was available to him and those around him. I don't know what it was, but something about his thoughts and his posting of these 95 theses that are around you, that something different happened on that day. The 95 theses are really riveting things, and so I thought I'd read them all right now. No, I won't read them all. It's important to know that the 95 theses and Luther's whole foundation wasn't out to break off and be a new church. He never had the intention, especially early on, of breaking off from anybody. Rather, he very genuinely thought that if he just expressed his thoughts, if he wrote them down, and even more importantly, if he had the chance to talk with the Pope of the day and the Pope's cardinals, the leadership of the day, that they would easily be swayed to his thoughts. He thought what he was writing there in those 95 theses and other things that he had written, if they would just sit down and listen to what he wrote, it would be so obvious to them. It would be so clear what was up in the world. Now, here I could talk for a couple hours on the Luther story, but we won't. Suffice to say, the church didn't give him, in that moment, the chance to speak. They were looking for one word: recant. Deny everything you've written and go back to where you were and be a quiet monk. Teach at the school and teach what we've told you to teach. Well, at one point, Luther gets taken away, and those who are sort of there in his stead rise up, and war unfolds, and all kinds of madness sort of takes place, and it's a bad thing for a while. And it isn't until later down the road where the church of the day decides to listen to the reformers. And as a result, it's both sides that change after that. I always feel bad that it seems like when we get to Reformation Sunday, it's us Lutherans and Protestants that got it right, and then it's the rest of the church that got it wrong, and they went on this static pole forever, and they're still wrong, like the Roman Catholic side of the church, which isn't at all true. Both churches had radical changes for these last 500 years. We're still having radical changes in our church over these years. And I wonder often if now, 500 years later, if Luther would be happy about the place that we find ourselves in the church. That is to say that there is a Roman Catholic church and a Protestant church that's into a billion small little churches. Again, I think probably not, because Luther wanted to affect change, a remolding of what was already there, a reforming of what was already there, not a recreation of something off to the side. This is a powerful thing to think about here 500 years later. There have been many sociologists, anthropologists, theologians that are arguing that, similar to 500 years ago, we are in the middle of another Reformation. And the Reformation just didn't have to deal with religion 500 years ago, but it had to do with all of culture, all of the world. And so we are in one of these places right now, a radical change in all of the world. I mean, that's why probably none of us raise our hands, because we like change, because everything is changing so fast. It makes us uncomfortable, right? Don't we all feel this in the world around us? Yeah, man, it's heavy. So I love reading books about this change and about this reality. And it occurred to me, so a friend of mine said this to me a while ago. He's about my age. He said one day, as we were at a meeting with the bishop and the assistants to the bishop, He said, in my life, the church has been dying the whole time. I was born in 1982. In my life, the church has been dying the whole time. I was never alive in the heyday of the church. I was never alive when you just opened the doors and things were successful. In my life, we've always been struggling, especially at the little wee country church I grew up in. Ask my parents. They'll be glad to tell you about struggle of the church. But that's only been my experience. And so when I hear the word change for church, don't yell at me. I'm actually a bit optimistic about that. It's actually a bit exciting for me. Change? Fantastic. It's been kind of breaking my whole life. I'm probably part of the problem. So I've been telling the council, I've invited the council to read this book with me. It's called Canoeing the Mountains. And again, I never come up with creative new ideas myself. This was our bishop's idea, and he was reading it with his staff, and so I read it, and it is a great book. I'm not sure what the council thinks of that. You might want to ask them later if they think it's such a great book, but let me read to you the first page. Did I hear a yes? Thank you, Shirley. I gave her $10 before church to say that. This is the first page about this huge shift in culture. One night, after a long day of meetings, an older pastor let out a heavy sigh. He was nearing retirement, and we were working together on a project that was supposed to reorganize our entire denomination in order to help our church better minister in a changing world. And that changing world weighed on him. He remembered well how not long ago life was different. He swirled his drink and he said to me, when I began my ministry in a church in Alabama, I never worried about church growth or worship attendance or evangelism. Back then, if a man didn't come to church on Sunday, his boss asked him about it on Monday. And then he writes, sociologists and theologians refer to this recently passed period as Christendom, the 1700-year-long era where Christianity at the privileged center of Western culture. Christendom gave us blue laws, right? Before me. Sorry, don't. Blue laws. It gave us the 10 Commandments in school. It gave us under God in the Pledge of Allegiance and exhortations to Bible reading in the national newspapers. I have a copy of the LA Times from December of 1963 that has stories on the Warren Commission, the 9,000-member Hollywood Presbyterian Church, and a list of daily Bible readings for the upcoming week. Can you even imagine the LA Times exhorting people to read their Bibles today? It was the day when every city father laid out the town square with the courthouse, the library, and the first church of Lutherans, naturally, at the center of the city. And then he writes, for most of us, these days are long gone. Isn't that awesome? Doesn't that get you fired up? No! It's terrifying. Right. So throughout this book, for those who are history buffs, you'll love it. He uses the analogy of the Lewis and Clark expedition all through the book. And for those who know, a few of you you already know this story, but Lewis and Clark were commissioned by the government to find the Northwest Passage, to go from the Mississippi River over whatever was there, west of there, to the Pacific Ocean. And everybody in those days imagined that what they would have to go over was probably like what they already knew in the East. What's in the East if you're going from the Atlantic to the Mississippi? The Appalachian Mountains, right? 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 foot peaks. I just biked up them a couple months ago. They feel like a lot more than 6,000, let me tell you. But that's what they would find when they went west. And so Lewis and Clark and their expedition of 30-plus men got in their canoes with all their weather gear and with all their canoes, and they intended to ride up the Mississippi and then the Missouri, and then they'd get to the headwaters, and they'd probably have to pick up their canoes and carry it through a pass or a gap in the mountains, and then down the next river into the Pacific Ocean. Well, they paddle their canoes up the Mississippi, up the Missouri. They stay in the Dakotas in the middle of the winter with the Indians. And then they finally, in the spring, get to the headwaters of the Missouri River. And they write in his journal about this place where you could literally straddle the river, feet on each side of the Missouri River. And there's a little bluff that they have to climb over the top. And Meriwether Lewis in his journal writes, we climbed up over the bluff, and we looked beyond, and what did they see? The Rocky Mountains, Rather than 4,000 or 5,000 foot passes, they saw 10,000 foot snow-covered mountains. Whoops. So what did they do? They kept those canoes in the water and just paddled and right? No. Well, obviously, they couldn't use their canoes any longer, and they were left with this decision. Do they pack it all back up and just go back down the river and go back home? Or do they move forward? And if they move forward, everything that they had thought, everything that they had prepared for, everything they had brought with them was the wrong stuff for moving forward. It was imperative to get them to this point, but if they were going to go over the mountains, they needed to rethink their plan. Those canoes, abandon ship, or cut them up and do something different. They needed to find horses to go through the mountains. They needed to make snowshoes. That's where the canoes came in handy, I would imagine. They had to convince the men that this new journey, this new thing was worth endeavoring. And guess what? Everybody in the whole party bought into Lewis and Clark's idea. Here's one of my favorite parts about it. I could go on for a long time talking about this metaphor. My favorite part, though, is none of these guys had any clue how to navigate the mountains. They didn't know the way through, right? So they had to listen to a new voice. They had to ask for help. A group of men had to ask for directions. That's shocking, right? And guess who gave them directions? A woman, a 19-year-old woman, a pregnant 19-year-old woman, then a woman that had had a brand new little baby. And she didn't just give them directions, she went with them. They took Sacagawea, an Indian princess, not even a white man or white person like all the rest of them. Talk about a crazy, unexpected voice to go with them. And not only did she know the way, or knew a way through the mountains, but she saved their butts numerous times. A group of explorers looked an awful lot like a group of warring people, especially not being the same skin color as the native people there. But every time a warring band of Indians would come upon them, they would see a nursing mom in their group. Apparently, it was not common for warring groups to carry nursing mothers with them. Weird, right? And so every group of Indians that would come upon them would say, oh, clearly they're not out to be warring against anybody. They're explorers for real, or else they wouldn't have her with them. Well, all this to say, I love this metaphor for where we are right now. We are, in many ways, as a church and as a culture, but especially as a church, and I don't mean just House of Prayer, but this is all my brothers and sisters who are in ministry around our synod, around Pittsburgh, around the country. We are at the headwaters of the Missouri, and we've got our canoes, but our canoes can't go over the mountains, and we're in the mountains. Sounds kind of scary, doesn't it? Well, this book just gave us all the answers on what to do, right, council people? Not. There are no answers for this moment. But there isn't an answer, I guess, but there are some things to think about and things to do. And one thing he says overwhelmingly in this book is change. And change quickly and radically. Not necessarily changing all of worship or changing things like that, but be willing to try new things. Be willing to fail. I'm good at failing. I do that a lot. Ask Stacy. Be willing as a community to try something different, give it a go, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't go. We have done that a lot in the 9 years I've been here. We tried this crazy thing called manna. And one of the people who I respect most in this congregation told me after we finally decided we were going to do it every week, she looked at me and she said, "That'll never work, Pastor." It sort of did. But then we've tried other things. People have said, "That'll never work, Pastor." And doggone it, they were right. It did not work. The other profound thing about this book that I think it calls us to is community. I mean, here's where I'll draw the parallel to Luther. It was not Luther's intent to go a different direction, to go a direction by himself. Rather, it was to remake the thing that he loved so much, the church. It was to stay together amidst these changes, to bring up the topics and then talk about them and then move together to a new place. That is what I think is before us also. Not to break apart and someone want to do this thing and someone want to do this thing and we'll do our own things over in our own places, but to try new things together. That is the beauty of this community. I mean, look at all of us here this morning. I've grown to really like some of you over these last 9 years. And I have hope at this moment in history, not because of my skill set or my gifts, but because of you and the gifts that God has given to all of you and to us collaboratively. So change, change, change. I will go back to Jesus now to wrap things up. Jesus actually was a real agent of change also. Think about it. He was in a Roman society, but wasn't Roman. They killed him. He grew up in the church, the Jewish church, and yet stood apart from many of the religious leaders there. He had lots of people following him, and yet he continued to push those followers either. Jesus was not about the status quo, about keeping things easy or where they were. God has always been a God of change. Maybe now is one of those moments where we can be people of change too. Together, not one by ourselves. When one of us goes off by ourselves, it has a tendency to be crazy and out in left field. That's the value of community. It's the value of what Luther was asking for. Let me bring my perspective in with all of you, and we can wrestle with it together. I think that's where our hope is right now. So friends, let us wrestle together with our future. It is changing radically and quickly, but I believe God is at the center of it still. Amen.